Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today is the first in a multi-part series where I'll be looking at player-driven design and its merits as an approach to building computer games. My focus in this series will be highlighting the unique strengths of titles like Counter-Strike or StarCraft, and explaining why I think they feature game design that's just as brilliant and deep as titles that tend to get more attention from the design community, like Dark Souls or Shovel Knight. Personally, I think these kinds of popular multiplayer games don't get enough appreciation from the perspective of good game design. Today's focus will be on the fundamentally different role a designer plays in games like Counter-Strike relative to more traditional games and the gameplay impact of this difference in philosophy. Let me first start by explaining what I mean when I say games like Counter-Strike. The traditional approach to game design that you'll see in books like The Art of Game Design or Introduction to Game Design is what I'll call designer-driven design. This approach calls for the designer to be the fundamental driver of a game. What a player does generally stems in some way from decisions that a designer made. These kinds of games tend to follow a fairly typical gameplay loop. The player encounters some obstacle, the player learns how to deal with the obstacle, the player gets past the obstacle, the player receives some reward, the reward incentivizes the player to move forward. Now you could argue that all games theoretically fit this mold, since everything you do in any game was enabled in some way by a game designer. But what really defines designer-driven design is the degree to which the designer owns and drives a player's experience. For instance, how similar are two different playthroughs by two different people? How strong are the incentives in encouraging specific ways of playing the game? How does the designer react when players do something they didn't expect? Do they see it as an issue in communicating the right playstyle, or do they see it as a good thing? Games like Counter-Strike, and more broadly most games that work well as esports, adopt a different approach that I'll call player-driven design. The designer is responsible for creating a right-sized sandbox and supplying the player with enough sufficiently balanced tools to enable player creativity and individual playstyles. The designer acts more like a facilitator than an all-seeing creator. As a result, the core reward loop revolves around moment-to-moment gameplay rather than obstacles the designer intentionally set up. The player plays the game, leveraging their individual style to play the game as enjoyable. This incentivizes them to continue playing. Players aren't just inputs in the game designer's master plan, generic objects in a convoluted Rube Goldberg machine. Players drive the action themselves. Each player in a player-driven game experiences it differently because the prime mover of their experience is them, not the game designer. The difference between these two approaches is probably still fuzzy to many of you, so rest assured that the examples and main talking points I'll be leveraging in this video will make the concept clearer. However, before I jump in, I want to address a common misconception. Many people already think about games in the way that I described above, but the labels that they use are single-player and multiplayer. They think of single-player games as a fixed, designer-driven experience, and multiplayer games as emergent, player-driven experiences. I want to first explain why this is the wrong way of thinking about the issue. The real difference between these types of games comes down to how much of the experience is driven by the player versus how much is driven by the designer. For instance, a single-player game like Dark Souls will naturally gravitate toward being designer-driven, but numerous design decisions by its developers allow it to be a hybrid of the two approaches. No one experiences Dark Souls exactly the same as anyone else. It takes great care not to force a specific approach to leveling, equipment, or playstyles onto its player base. Even the order in which the game's areas can be tackled will differ substantially from person to person. On the other hand, a multiplayer game like Battlefield 1 will naturally gravitate toward emergent, player-driven gameplay, but the way it's been designed actually pushes it closer to the designer-driven side. Virtually every interaction in Battlefield 1 features a heavy hand of the game designer. Its incentive systems around ranking up and getting weapon unlocks, its kits, dreadnoughts and armored trains, its squad systems, classes, destructible environments, and so on. Playing Battlefield 1 is much more about playing the role the designer has crafted for you and playing the game in the way it was designed to be played rather than forging your own playstyle. A comparison between Counter-Strike Global Offensive and Battlefield 1's graphical styles helps differentiate these two approaches. Graphics is a useful area to focus on because it's one of the most traditionally designer-driven features in a computer game. The art style, animations, graphical fidelity, and so on are built to execute on a designer's vision. Battlefield is a great example of doing this well. The detailed environments, realistic weaponry, and incredible animations all work in tandem to build a pretty reasonable take on compelling shooter gameplay in a World War I setting. Now, if we make the mistake of adopting the same lens to analyze Global Offensive, we'll find it to be pretty underwhelming. There's far less detail, the color scheme comes across as unrealistically high contrast, and the animations are basic at best. From a traditional designer-driven perspective, Global Offensive does a pretty bad job immersing the player in a gripping counterterrorism experience. Watching a bomb get defused as you wildly rotate your camera as a spectator is more comical than anything else. Compare Nuke or Dust 2 with virtually any game involving tactical SWAT, and the first thing you'll observe is how unbelievably bright Counter-Strike's levels are. It makes it practically impossible to get immersed in some kind of narrative experience. The issue here is not the game itself, but the way we've decided to look at it, specifically the designer-driven perspective and the role graphics traditionally play in computer games. The truth is that Counter-Strike is not trying to achieve the same things as most shooters. It cares more about facilitating moment-to-moment gameplay and allowing players to drive the experience themselves instead of designing the obstacles ahead of time. Let's do a comparison. Here I'm playing a medic class trying to defend an objective in Battlefield 1. Notice how much of my screen is dominated by what the designer wants me to care about. The objective marker, the mustard gas, the destructible environment, the waving flag. Even the air itself is moving. Notice how the lack of contrast in the graphical style means that nothing really pops unless the designer wants it to, like the bright flare of a tank shot or a notification that a grenade is nearby. The designer has effectively monopolized my attention and can force me to focus wherever they think is important. You can see how this happens by listening to the developers talk about the gameplay. Here's Robert Samlin, a senior concept artist at DICE, answering a question about keeping the player visually engaged after seeing the same map hundreds of times. Battlefield is also about the epicness of it, the vastness, and so it's key we get that into each level. We also cater to a good variation with everything. The idea is that no battle is ever the same. In level design, a big factor is our dynamic events, and the destruction this time is more intuitive, it's more natural. We can reshape the environment around you when you play, but also things like the dynamic weather comes in to give a sort of fresh unpredictability to levels. You can have clear rain suddenly turn to thick fog, or heavy rain, and in the case of Sinai Desert, there's a sandstorm, making sure that it's never the same experience twice. You always have a new one. Notice how Mr. Samlin assumes that it's his job, as a concept artist, not even a game designer, but a concept artist, to keep the game fresh and varied. The graphical style is intentionally complex and multifaceted because the developers of the game, all the way down to the concept artists, see themselves as responsible for driving the experience. Now compare this with my Silver 1 attempt to defend the B bomb site on Nuke. Notice the distinct lack of environmental detail and moving parts. The scene is extremely bright and the lines incredibly sharp. Pay particular attention to the overly vivid color contrast. This means that no matter where I choose to stare, my eyes don't lose focus or get distracted because there's enough contrast to keep them engaged. There's just a hell of a lot less going on here, and the stuff that is there is designed to complement the gameplay experience rather than define it. There's nothing about the graphical style that implies, suggests, or forces a certain playstyle. The game gets out of my way and lets me and my team drive that experience. When I'm defending this bomb site, I'm thinking about the way I want to play the site. What works best for my team, what I think will effectively beat the opposing team, what I think I'm good at, and so on. The designer is facilitating the situation rather than assuming they're responsible for driving it. This focused art style is one of the things that hooked me back in the original game, so it's worth pointing out that I think earlier versions handled this a bit better than Global Offensive. Here's the 1.6 version of the same corridors in Nuke. We know that Battlefield's art style is intentionally complex, but can we say the same about the simplicity of Counter-Strike's? After all, as we've seen, Global Offensive is visually much busier than 1.6. Perhaps the lack of detail is an artifact of the source engine rather than intentional game design. While the difference between player-driven and designer-driven design is in large part philosophical and process-oriented, meaning the graphics designers may not have thought about this specific point, but the processes they were immersed in nonetheless produced it, and therefore I'd argue it's reasonable to call it intentional. I know that's a bit of a stretch, so bear with me. My next point about viscerality provides some evidence for this. Viscerality is the way a feature in a game feels. A great example of this is the rumble feature you see in modern controllers. It adds weight and feeling to the actions in a computer game. Viscerality is very important in Counter-Strike thanks to the way it structures its reward systems. The core gameplay loop stems from just playing it, not some objective, leveling, ranking, or other contrived system that the designer has built in. Viewers may argue that Counter-Strike has all of these systems, but the key point is that they don't drive gameplay. To understand this, think about how medals are designed in Battlefield 1. The designer crafts compelling challenges that encourage the player to do things that a group of playtesters, balanced developers, and other developers have collectively agreed is fun. Once they're finished, the player receives a satisfying reward. The medals rotate regularly, so players always have fresh content to engage with. It's a classic gameplay loop, and the designer is in the driver's seat the whole time. You can see this for yourself by listening to the developers. Here's how DICE describes how the medal system has changed in Battlefield 1. Battlefield veterans will notice some changes in how the commemorations work this time around. Each medal still has a specific unlock criteria, but in Battlefield 1, you have the freedom to choose which medals to pursue. There are always 5 medals to choose from, and this quintet of decorations is rotated on a weekly basis. Think about the mindset that goes into writing a statement like this. Players in Battlefield have always had the freedom to choose what medals they pursued. The difference in Battlefield 1 is the continuous presence of the game designer, building rigidly crafted weekly challenges. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. On the contrary, I'll always get behind fresh content and developer support. All I'm pointing out is the underlying philosophy. The more the designer is involved, the more the designer drives the experience. The better it is for the player, the more quote-unquote freedom the player has. By contrast, Counter-Strike's formal reward systems are orthogonal to what you actually do in the game. Experience, leveling, and the in-game economy serve primarily to build stickiness into the title. Here's Bronwyn Grimes, a technical artist at Valve, talking about the company's approach. We can measure the success of our economy by checking on just a few broad metrics, and they're maybe not the ones you'd think. After all, adding the economy isn't an end in and of itself. We're adding the economy in service of our goals. So we'll look at player numbers, player retention, and playtime. If our customers are having fun, they'll come back for more. In other words, the goal of the title's formal reward systems is to drive engagement with the core gameplay. And one of the ways you make the core gameplay fun is with viscerality. To demonstrate this, let's take a closer look at firing an AK. Every time the player pulls the trigger, their arm snaps back. The front of the gun lights up as the bullet rapidly exits the chamber. Smoke drifts away from the top and sides of the gun. The bullet's trajectory cuts a line across the map. The sound of the shot thunders powerfully through the air. The result is that just firing a weapon feels good. It feels really satisfying. This has a big impact on the player experience. In fact, nowadays most modern shooters understand this, and expend significant efforts to make shooting a fun and visceral experience. Battlefield is no different. Firing weapons in that game is really fun too. However, what I want to focus on is weapon switching, a feature that more than any other showcases Counter-Strike's focus on the player experience. Weapon switching in Counter-Strike feels so goddamn good. The animation is clean, the cocking on the gun makes you feel like a badass, and the shift in movement speed builds anticipation for your next action. Hearing the clicking sound of a knife as you rapidly switch weapons is addictive. Hell, even professional players sometimes get themselves killed, mindlessly switching weapons when they should be sticking to one. Play any amount of Counter-Strike, and the first thing you notice is the compulsion of many players to constantly switch weapons back and forth for essentially no reason. They do this because it feels really, really good. Now contrast that with Battlefield. Notice how much flatter the animations feel. Notice how it doesn't seem properly optimized. The latter half runs too quickly. Notice how much more basic the hand movement is. The overall package feels boring. It feels like a chore. But how could that be? You'd think a big company like DICE building a AAA Call of Duty competitor would get something simple like this right, but then you'd be misunderstanding how they approach game development. See, weapon switching is a purely visceral experience. Aside from the way it's balanced, like how many weapons you have and so on, the actual switch itself is just something players do in order to interact with the game. In other words, from a traditional game design perspective, it's easy to think of it more like an obstacle preventing the player from enjoying your game. Your focus as the designer is on the player's ability to arrive at a weapon rather than the actual act of switching weapons. Given this perspective, how surprising is it that something the designer views as a chore ends up being implemented as a chore? Counter-Strike works differently because it's fundamentally player-driven. The developers don't care what weapons you use. Guns are just tools that you use to drive your own experience. As a result, the developers put their focus on the moment-to-moment gameplay and make sure the act of switching itself is fun. This ensures there's no friction in the player pulling out the tool they want to use at any given moment. This is what I mean when I talk about development processes. The fact that a comparatively small team puts so much effort into a feature that massive companies consider trivial shows that they fundamentally think about their product differently. The priorities simply aren't the same. This is why I don't buy arguments that say the graphical style is somehow accidental. I really doubt anyone on the development team sat down and said, hey, in our game, weapon switching deserves 1,000 times more resources than every other shooter on the market. But their development philosophy and their goals with the game naturally led to that conclusion, much the same way that I think it led to a clean and straightforward art design. Another area where this comes up is weapon selection. Let's dive into the philosophical differences between weapons in Counter-Strike and those in other shooters. Weapons in CS are an extension of the player. They help the player achieve their ends rather than forcing the player in a specific direction. To use an analogy, picking up a paintbrush doesn't imply what kind of painting you're going to create. The paintbrush is just a tool, a means that you leverage to build what you're trying to build. The game achieves this through its balanced design around an unreachably high skill ceiling. Spray patterns, interactions between accuracy and movement, optimal movement across a map, playing your opponent's positions, coordinating effectively with teammates, and so on, are deep, complex, and fine-grained skills that can never really be mastered, only improved upon. Because the skill ceiling is unreachable, a player who works hard to develop skill in a particular playstyle will beat a player who works less hard on a theoretically more optimal way of playing the game. The high skill ceiling removes the concept of diminishing returns, and the harder working player wins out. This also has the effect of preventing a stale metagame, because what really matters is who's playing, not what the game prescribes. In other words, doing something well matters more than anything else. Execution matters, aka the name of this series. Players tend to get good at things that they like doing because they do them a lot. Over time, every player in Counter-Strike ends up building a unique and individual playstyle, almost like a fingerprint. Their way of playing the game and engaging with their teammates is an expression of their own individuality and creativity rather than something designed into the game. Counter-Strike doesn't tell you to play an AK aggressively or passively, it doesn't tell you to attempt that long-distance headshot or play more quietly, it doesn't tell you to spray in this instance and burst in that instance, it doesn't say how you should effectively use it to complement a fellow opper, it doesn't tell you whether or not you should peek, and so on. What defines a good decision is your skill and ability as a player. The title hands you a paintbrush and a canvas and allows you to proceed however you think is best. Contrast this with weapons you see in a game like Battlefield 1. Weapons play specific roles. Tons of tuning and balance goes into effective range, fire rate, damage against vehicles, and so on. A medic trying to take an objective who comes across a faraway sniper isn't going to make a personal decision about the right approach to the problem. The role the designer has given them is countered by the role the designer has given their opponent. Coming across a tank doesn't call for individual creativity, it calls for anti-tank weapons, because the designer says so. The weapons in Battlefield 1 play a role, and by selecting them the player is choosing how they'd like to play the game. Weapons don't bend to the player's creativity the way weapons in Counter-Strike do. Instead, players bend to the role weapons are built for. Alright, so we've now managed to cover three pretty big areas that are significantly impacted by the contrasting philosophies of player-driven and designer-driven game design. In this last section, I want to highlight why this matters. Sometimes people respond to analyses like this by saying, different games are different, so what? Well, to begin with, I think a clean graphical style, a visceral and satisfying player experience, and deep, complex gameplay all provide value on their own. Frankly, I think that's enough. These are big topics that matter to a lot of people. But let's go further than that. One advantage of comparative analyses is that they underscore how important interdependency is in game design. Gameplay features are not standalone. There is a tendency by many players to see game design as a collection of features, where games can be evaluated by the sum total of what's included in the box. Comparing Counter-Strike and Battlefield demonstrates that this is not always accurate. Adding more features, like more weapons, can also remove other features, like expression of individual playstyles. Comparative analyses also give us insight into how a feature should be implemented. Game design is not binary. It's rarely a matter of simply deciding whether or not to include a feature. Completely randomizing spray patterns is a great idea for a game like Borderlands, because it reinforces the differences between weapons and forces players to pay attention to their equipment. Meanwhile, it would be horrible in a game like Counter-Strike. The weapon is an extension of the player, so it's important that it's fully under their control. If the designer fails to fully consider the purpose of a feature, they may not implement it correctly, and sometimes looking at other games helps build that understanding. I'm as surprised as anyone that perfect weapon accuracy in Global Offensive has a maximum range, and I wonder if the paintbrush analogy would change the designer's perspective on this issue. Finally, comparisons like this can be deeply cathartic. The choice of Battlefield 1 as a comparison wasn't an accident. Don't get me wrong, I really like the game and I still play it. But as someone who put hundreds of hours into Battlefield 2 and 3, I couldn't help but notice how much the series has changed. It feels more and more like I'm a cog in DICE's Rube Goldberg machine than an individual player trying to play the objective in my own way. Researching and building comparisons like this help me understand why games appeal to me, and also sometimes why they don't. Battlefield is a series I've been playing for more than 10 years, and understanding why it doesn't feel as good as before can be the first step in appreciating what's new about it, taking it at face value instead of through the lens of its predecessor's baggage. At the very least, it helps build appreciation for the fantastic games of the past. That can be really cathartic, and I'd imagine there are folks watching this video who feel the same way. We've gone pretty long today, so this is a good stopping point. Thanks for watching. I hope this video gave you a new perspective on player-driven games. In the future, I'll be continuing this series and writing more about esports in general. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, please consider following me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.